Buonasera.
Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti. Io sono Andrea Gentile, direttore editoriale della casa editrice Saggiatore, che inaugura per il secondo anno questo ciclo di conferenze, i cui appuntamenti potrete vedere in questo pratico schermo. E non mi resta che presentare l'incontro di questa sera, il cui titolo è Che cos'è l'economia? L'autore è il Lord Mervyn King, il quale è autore anche di un nostro libro, uscito proprio presso questa casa editrice da poco, che in italiano è stato tradotto con il seguente titolo: La fine dell'alchimia. Con lui dialogherà il professor Luca Fantacci e vi ringrazio moltissimo per questa giornata e buon proseguimento.
Grazie. Buonasera a tutti, poi mi scuserete, io parlerò in inglese in modo da facilitare poi la traduzione unidirezionale, quindi chi è interessato alla traduzione, visto che c'è un servizio di traduzione simultanea. Just a few words of introduction to present the author of the book and the special guest this evening, who, for I'm sure most of you, does not require presentations. You know that he was governor of the Bank of England from 2003 to 2013, and he is now teaching at the York University and fellow at the London School of Economics. I will not spend further words introducing the author. I will say a few words about the book, since he himself specifies the spirit and the perspective in which he has written the book. It's not a book of memoirs, but it is a book, I would say a brave book, which attempts to look back on the crisis and the years which preceded it, with a view to detecting the structural elements of the financial system which have led to the crisis and which produced the fragility of the system itself. I believe it's one of the few books, one of the many books that have appeared since the crisis broke out, which has the advantage of leaving aside all the more superficial and contingent factors that have played a role in the outbreak of the crisis, to concentrate on more fundamental issues which have to do with the architecture of the monetary and the financial system. And not only to provide an analysis, diagnosis, but also a proposal to radically reform the monetary system and how it works. So, without further ado, I will start from the first question which the author himself raises at the very beginning, and which perhaps has come to the mind of many of us looking back, I can't even say looking back at the crisis, because especially in our country, it's still ongoing. Who is responsible for this crisis? Is it a problem and a responsibility of the people who were in charge, of the actors? Is it a responsibility of the institutions, or is it a responsibility of the ideas that have led to this situation?
Well, thank you, Luca, and ladies and gentlemen, buonasera. It's a great privilege to be here in Milan, which is not only a financial centre, but a centre of design, fashion, everything. So I'm delighted to be here. And the question you posed, I think, does go to the heart of what I try to talk about in the book. During the crisis and afterwards, many people thought, if only we put a few bankers in prison, that's what should happen. And I think that is a dangerous view, because it leads you to conclude that if we just put some people in prison, we would never have a crisis again. And I think that's wrong, because after the crisis, I reflected on what we did and what happened. And I came to the view that deep down, the problems were a failure of ideas. That all of us, whether it's central banks or commercial banks or politicians, had failed to appreciate really how the economy worked, the scale of the problems that were building up, the fragility in the financial system, and how it was possible for what looked a very successful financial system suddenly, from one day to the next, almost literally one day to the next, to change to something that was so fragile that nobody wanted to lend to a bank at all. And how can that come about? And I think that over the years, economists have tried very hard to treat economics and the economy like physics, a material world with scientific laws that govern the behavior. And we had forgotten that people's beliefs and their expectations are fundamental in determining the behavior of the economy. This is what makes the economy different from the behavior of the planets going around the sun or any scientific phenomenon where there are fixed laws that govern their behavior. And instead, people's beliefs and expectations are crucial. And I think that some economists in the past clearly understood that, but over the last 50 years, economists have tried to make the subject more scientific, more mathematical, and in the attempt to do that, we've gone down the wrong path, and many of the ideas about macroeconomics, about banking, about how to regulate banks, were mistaken because we believed that it could all be done in a purely scientific way.
Well, one aspect which is crucial and which you focus on throughout the book, which has both a practical and theoretical relevance, is what you call, following Keynes, fundamental uncertainty, which makes the economics profession radically different, as you suggest, from any hard physical science.
Yes.
The fact that the object of this science has to do with human behavior in a context where the future is radically uncertain, where there is no possibility of making accurate forecasts. What role does the fundamental uncertainty play in the economic system? And perhaps more importantly, what role does our attitude towards fundamental uncertainty play, the way we try to address it?
So let me give you two examples of where radical or fundamental uncertainty turn out to be of basic importance. One is thinking about banks and financial markets. For a long time, economists and people in finance departments, in business schools, have believed that uncertainty could be defined in terms of writing down the long list of all the things that could happen in the future, and assuming that individuals could attach probabilities to each of them. And if you could do that, then it was possible to price all the risk or uncertainty that's out there in the world. And if you can price all the risks, then you can create financial instruments or pieces of paper that represent those risks and trade them in a market. And then you could ensure that all the risks, people could take out all the insurance they needed. That was the basis on which banks were regulated. So people in Basel and in the international banking system created a regulatory system for banks which said, well, these are the risks that banks are taking. We can calculate precisely how big that risk is, and so we can work out how much equity finance banks ought to be asked to issue. A very good example of this is the British bank Northern Rock, which failed in 2007. Only a few months before it failed, Northern Rock, there were two things which were true about Northern Rock. The first was that it had what's called a leverage ratio, that is the total amount of debt which the bank had issued relative to the funds of its own shareholders, of 80 to 1, 80 to 1. That meant that for every euro of equity funds available to absorb losses. There were 80 euros of debt finance out there. So a very small tremor fall in the value of the bank's assets would make it insolvent. So it was very risky. However, it was also true that according to the latest international standards developed in Basel, Northern Rock was probably the safest bank in Britain, because they had assumed, they calculated based on data what they thought the risks were. And in essence, they thought that if a bank lent money in the form of mortgage loans, it wasn't really taking a risk. Well, how wrong can you be? And I don't want to blame anyone for this, because sometimes things happen in the world that we can't easily anticipate. This is what radical uncertainty is. The Americans have a phrase for it: stuff happens. And it happens, and we can't prepare for it or anticipate it. And most of the big political events in the world that have shaped the history of the last 30 years and were fundamental to the financial crisis emerging were events that no one could easily imagine happening beforehand. So you can't price them. So the idea that somehow finance can just be a purely scientific subject where you can price and value all the financial assets in the world, and this gives you perfect insurance opportunities, is a dangerous delusion. And it's one which not just people working in banks fell prey to, but the regulators fell prey to, politicians did, the media did, everyone did. We all thought the system was very successful. But in fact, once we saw the emergence of the possibility that house prices could fall sharply, everything changed. The other example I give is in terms of people trying to understand macroeconomics and how we can try and stabilize the economy. And a very great American economist, Robert Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize, said just a few years before the crisis, we've solved the problems of macroeconomic stabilization. What he meant was, we'd solved the problems in the model that we were using, but not in the world. And what was the difference between the model that he was using and the world? Radical uncertainty. The possibility that things that you can't imagine happening come along, stuff happens. And then people have to cope with this and react to it. And then you can get big changes in people's decisions as to how much to spend or save. And you can either get a boom where people are too optimistic, or a slump or depression where they're too pessimistic. And there's nothing in the market economy that guarantees that the economy is self-stabilizing. Once you get into this position of low demand, high unemployment, you can stay there for a long time. And once you're in a boom, as Alan Greenspan in the States discovered, he tried to warn people in the stock market that they were too optimistic. He called it irrational exuberance. And it went on for years afterwards, until one day it stopped. And this is the big lesson from history about crises, which is something that appears unsustainable can actually continue for much longer than you can easily imagine. But when it comes to an end, the crisis occurs much faster than you could imagine. And this is not, a scientific phenomenon. This is the reflection of human behavior.
The examples you gave and the observations you are making perhaps lead us to think that there is a fragility of the system which depends on the fact that we don't know. And then there's a fragility of the system which depends on the fact that we think we don't, and that we address this lack of knowledge with models which give us the impression and the illusion of being able to control and calculate everything. But as you suggest, the problem is structural. So you mentioned this problem from the very title of the book, which is, as you heard, the end of alchemy. By the way, I'm sure you noticed walking in the room that there are some books available at the entrance for purchase. So when you walk out, you can purchase the book on the spot. The end of alchemy is somehow the summary of the proposal and of what you advocate. We have to put an end to the alchemy which is embedded in the capitalist system. What is this alchemy about?
So it's basically that the monetary and banking system works provided people trust it, but once they lose trust, then it can collapse. And that trust can be fragile. So, for example, we all use paper currency. It has no underlying value, just a piece of paper. And, I would go into schools when I was at the Bank of England, and I'd have school children aged 8 or 9. And I'd say, well, what's this? And they'd say, it's money. And they're holding a £10 note. And I'd say, no, it's not money, it's a piece of paper. And they'd say, no, it's money. And I'd say, no, it's a piece of paper, look. And I'd try and tear it in two, and they'd shout out, no, don't. And I'd ask them, so what's the difference between a piece of paper and money? And they'd say, well, if it's money, you can buy stuff with it. But you can only buy stuff with it if the person you want to buy something from will accept it. So it depends on trust. It's even more dramatic in the case of banks, because banks have obviously two sides to their balance sheet. Double entry bookkeeping is perhaps the only natural law in economics, an Italian invention. And the assets of banks tend to be long-term and very risky, and the liabilities are short-run, and the holders of these liabilities think they're safe. Well, you can't convert short-term, safe finance into long-term risky investments. That is alchemy. But it works most of the time. Well, it does work most of the time because people don't ask for their money back from the bank. But every now and then, something happens and people lose confidence in the bank, or even worse, in the banking system as a whole. And they do take their money out or stop lending to banks. And then the banks fail because they need more short-term finance to support the long-term loans they've made, and they haven't got it. And the point in the book is that in a world of radical uncertainty, banks can look very safe, very successful, profitable for many years, and then suddenly, without any notice really, people are unwilling to lend to them, and then they fail. And when they fail, the only thing that you can do is either to let the banks collapse, go bankrupt. And we don't want to do that because the banks are fundamental to the system of making payments. You can't get paid your salary if the banking system collapses. You can't pay your mortgage payment or your bills. So this is a fundamental part of the infrastructure of our economy. So it's left to the government to throw money at the banks when they're at risk of failing. And people don't like the banks being bailed out. But I think we should step back and take a different look at this and say, in a deep financial crisis, the only institution that can provide liquidity is the government or the central bank. The private sector won't do it. So if the public sector is going to provide liquidity in a crisis, then what it needs to do is to ask the banks to take out an insurance premium every year when there isn't a crisis, so that when the crisis happens, they can say, and the government can say to ordinary people, look, it's sensible to allow the banks to borrow from us. We're not giving them money, they're only being allowed to borrow, because they paid the insurance premium in order to be able to borrow from the central bank when a crisis occurs. So what will the insurance policy look like? Well, I remember when the Royal Bank of Scotland failed in October 2008, and it came to the Bank of England, and it said, it's strange what's going on. We used to be able to borrow for 3 months. Then, after Lehman Brothers failed, we could only borrow for 1 month. Then we could only borrow for 1 week. Then they could only borrow for 1 day. And then they came in and said, we shall fail tonight. So we couldn't let them fail. The whole banking system would have collapsed. And I wrote out a cheque for £36 billion in the way that one does. And they got their money. And I asked the staff of the bank, I said, so what is the security against which we're lending, the collateral? And they said, well, it's mortgages. And I said, well, whose mortgages? No idea, no idea. So my proposal is to recognise that in a crisis, the central bank will choose, in order to save the economy, to lend money to the banks in a crisis against a lot of these risky assets. In other words, the central bank will be behaving as what we call in English a pawnbroker. And the system I want to put in place, I call the pawnbroker for all seasons, which is where the banks have to take some of their assets to the central bank in normal times when there's no crisis and say, well, you know, you don't need to give us money by 5 o'clock tonight. Take your time, take 2 or 3 months, and then tell us at the end of that, if there were a crisis at any point in the next, say, 5 years, how much money would you be prepared to lend to us if we gave you these assets as collateral? And the rule I would impose is that the commercial banks have to take along to the central bank enough assets to qualify for a credit line big enough to pay off all the depositors in the bank or anyone else who's lent money to the bank for a very short period. And if we did that, then nobody would need to run from a bank. What happened in 2008 in New York were that money market funds and other investors in banks felt that the banking system was unsafe, so they just withdrew their money. And you can't blame them for it. Better to take the money out than run the risk of losing it. But if we had said that actually the banks always had a guaranteed cash credit line sufficient to repay the depositors, then no depositor would need to worry about that, and they wouldn't need to run. And this would constrain the extent to which banks did borrow short and lend long, but it wouldn't prevent them from doing it. They would still be able to borrow short and lend long. Banks would still operate as banks, but they would in effect be paying an insurance premium every year in normal times in order to be eligible or to qualify for borrowing from the central bank in a crisis. Because in a crisis, the only institution that can provide liquidity is the central bank. And I think that another example of what went wrong with regulation was that all these clever people in central banks and governments around the world met in Basel, and they said, well, what kind of regulation should we have? Let's try to imagine which assets will always be liquid and tell banks they have to hold some of those. But there are no assets which are always liquid. The only genuine and absolute guaranteed source of liquidity is the central bank that can print money just like that. And we need to recognise that, because in a world of radical uncertainty, you cannot be confident that any asset is going to be liquid. And so the only way to protect the banking system is to give a credit line to the central bank, but not to do it, as happened in 2008, basically free of charge, but to say, and you don't charge people in the crisis because that's self-defeating. You actually make people pay in advance. And I think the scheme is a practical scheme, it can work, and it would, I think, lead us to a new world where we didn't have bank runs.
I believe this is a very bold and at the same time a practical, viable proposal. One thing I forgot to tell you at the beginning is that we had in mind to carry on our conversation for roughly half an hour, and then leave you the opportunity to raise questions directly to Lord King. So I will ask him a few more questions, And now you know that you will have this opportunity and you can prepare, because of course he has laid many issues on the table. He has just given you a summary of this proposal, which I think has the merit of addressing an issue which seems to polarize the debate. You mentioned the fact that part of money creation, the essential part, the ultimate money, is carried out by the central bank in the name of the public. But the large part, the largest part, you mentioned the figures in the book, 90% of the money that we currently use is produced by the private banking system. With the issues of trust and instability that you were referring to before. So after the crisis, there has been, and there continues to be, a debate concerning whether it is a good idea to have private banks share the responsibility of performing a public service in the first place, creating money. And there are very extreme proposals in this respect. You mentioned the idea that entire money creation should be handed over to the bank, with advantages and drawbacks. And I believe your proposal has the advantage of leaving the possibility for the market and private banks to share the responsibility of creating money, but asking them in exchange to share the burden of the instability which is intrinsic to this process, through this form of insurance that you mentioned in the first place. You mentioned also the pressure that was on your shoulders as governor of the central bank in particularly frantic and delicate moments of the crisis, when you had to decide overnight to open a credit line of such large amounts to banks that were in trouble. Have there been, throughout these very difficult years, some lighter moments that you do not put in the book, because it's not a book of memoirs, but since you are here recalling some incidents you might want to share with us?
Well, there weren't many light moments. It was a pretty dark period during the crisis. And the strange thing about it was, to those of us involved every day, it didn't seem as dramatic as it did to people watching it on television. You know, when you watch the crisis on television for 10 minutes a day, it's like watching highlights of a football match. Even a boring match can look very exciting if you only see a few minutes highlights. And I remember one night, the television cameras showed something which I thought, oh no. And it was a meeting I had to go to in number 10 Downing Street to see the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And you may have seen on the television cameras the picture of the famous door of 10 Downing Street. People come out of this door and sometimes they talk to the cameras, or sometimes they wave and then walk down the street and leave. What people don't know, who've never done this, is that when you come out of the door of 10 Downing Street, you can't see a thing, because you're blinded by the lights of the television cameras and the flashing bulbs of the press photographers. But I knew this, so at the end of the meeting, I said to my private secretary, I said, look, just make sure the car's outside the door, because I won't see it, I want to make sure the car is there. So we went to the front door, and there is a man, a waiter who stands inside who opens the door. And I said, don't open it yet. And my private secretary got on his phone, and he said, okay, the car's outside. So I said to the waiter, okay, you can open the door. So he opened the door, we went out, blinded by the lights of the cameras and the flashing bulbs. I got into the back of the car, and my private secretary walked around to the other side and got in the other side of the car. And we sat there for about a minute before I said, with what I thought was a very calm voice, this isn't our car. And we waited for another minute before we got out of the car and walked across 10 Downing Street to where our car actually was. And we were watched by it was no more than 5 million television viewers. And the headline on the news that evening was, "Governor loses his way." So that was one of the moments that other people found amusing, even if I didn't.
Well, thank you. If there are already questions from the audience, we would be glad to take them. Please, I think we have a microphone. So, of course, you can ask the questions in Italian.
Yes, no problem. Professor King, I was one of your students.
Indeed, you were.
My question is, basically with your proposal, you are shifting the burden of an eventual bank failure from the government through the bank deposit insurance scheme to the banking system itself. Now, question is, what at that point is the role of the supervising institutions? Are they not to do their job?
Well, it's lovely to see you, Francesca. I won't tell people how many years ago it was, because they won't believe it. They won't believe it. So the question is, what should supervisors be trying to do? And I worry that they're trying to do too much. So in a world of radical uncertainty, I don't think you can know in advance the problems that banks will have. So it's very difficult and quite dangerous to write down very detailed rules. And one of the things that's happening now is that regulators are writing thousands of pages of rules in order to prevent a repetition of the last crisis. But the next crisis will be very different. We don't know how, but it will just be different. So I think the right approach is to say, if we don't know precisely what the next crisis will look like, what kinds of regulations are going to be the sensible things to put in place when we can't imagine precisely what will go wrong? And I think that leads you directly to two things. One is to say, banks will find new ways to lose money. So let's make sure that they do issue enough equity finance that they can absorb losses from wherever they come. So having higher what are called capital requirements to issue equity finance is the first thing. And the second thing, I think, is we know that when something unexpected happens and people lose confidence in banks, there can be a run on the bank. People take their money out. And my scheme, the pawnbroker for all seasons, basically guarantees that the central bank will provide the money and there won't be a bank run. So we remove bank runs from being a possibility. Now, that shifts some of the risk onto the central bank balance sheet and ultimately the taxpayer. But I think acting through the central bank, we can afford to take a long-term view when something goes wrong in a crisis. So if the assets of banks end up on the central bank balance sheet in a crisis, and the central bank has said, well, we're not going to lend you 100% of these assets in cash. We'll only lend you, say, 75%. And that difference between the two, called the haircut, is there to protect taxpayers if the central bank ends up owning the assets rather than just holding them for a short time. And once you've done those two things, then I think you have put in place a system that's robust to not knowing precisely what will happen in the future. And I would myself scrap a lot of the detailed regulations, but I just don't see they play much purpose other than providing a defense to the regulators if the crisis were to be repeated. And I think a more intelligent approach would be a good idea. So I think, for example, in the United States, Donald Trump is talking about getting rid of regulation. Well, I think there's a deal to be put on the table. We could get rid of a lot of detailed regulation, provided we made the banks issue a bit more equity finance and we put in place the pawnbroker for all seasons.
If I may briefly follow up on this, I was surprised by the fact that your proposal came from a former central banker, because it seems to put on the shoulders of the central bank a huge work in assessing in advance the assets of the banks. And I was even more surprised to read that you underline how certain central banks, including the Bank of England and the Bank of Australia, I believe, have already engaged in this sort of activity.
Yes, and the Federal Reserve too, to some extent.
So you point out as elements of realism of this proposal,
yes,
the fact that there are certain steps that have been already made in this direction. You could.
So that in the scheme that I described, banks would have to take some of their assets to the central bank in normal times in order to have that collateral value. And that's what Bank of England, Federal Reserve are indeed doing. Now, we need to go further, but one of the consequences of the use of quantitative easing, QE, is that the commercial banks have now got much bigger bank deposits with the central bank than they did before the crisis. And I wouldn't change that because it builds in a large amount of liquidity which is in the hands of the banking system. And that means we're much closer to the pawnbroker solution than we might otherwise be. And I am genuinely very worried by the attempt to write incredibly detailed regulations and rules, which many people in banks now feel they can't do anything without consulting their compliance officer. Well, that is dangerous for two reasons. One is that people don't know what the law is, they just go to their compliance officer. But secondly, it prevents the development of a proper ethical basis for banking, because it encourages the view that, well, as long as it's not banned in the regulations, I can do it. And that is how things go wrong. What you want are people in the financial sector who say, my job is to manage other people's money, and this is a tremendous privilege and a responsibility, and I have to think deeply about the fact that we call it in English stewardship. I am the steward of their money. And this is very different from the attitude which you did see in some financial institutions before the crisis, of saying, I'm dealing with these people in the market. I'm very smart and bright, that's why we're working here. The people there aren't as smart as I am, so I can exploit them and make money out of them. I will sell them stuff that they think is valuable, but I know it isn't. And this attitude of exploiting other people in the market is not an ethical response that we want to encourage. I think most people who work in financial institutions would rather feel that they were stewards of other people's money and helping them invest their money sensibly, but being responsible for it. And I think the financial crisis did come as a big shock to many people in financial institutions. They weren't all out there trying to exploit other people or trying to break the law at every opportunity. That's true of a small number of people, but the vast majority of people weren't in that position. Stuff happened which they didn't imagine. And giving people the right incentives to behave properly is really important. And in terms of financial regulation, I would just stick with capital requirements and the pawnbroker for all seasons rules and scrap a lot of the unnecessary detail.
I believe this is one of the most interesting and fascinating aspects of your proposal, and one of, on the other hand, the most relevant problems of the current approach to the crisis. The proliferation of regulation, which, as you say, is ultimately in contrast with the development of an ethical attitude. It seems that in the field of finance, there's a difficulty to establish sound principles from which you can judge, and you have to enter into the details of behavior. Otherwise, as you suggest, there is just simply the tendency to believe that whatever is not regulated and whatever is not controlled,
Just do it.
yeah.
No, and I think this is very important. I remember a former colleague of mine in the Bank of England left and went to run a fund management firm. And he said what really horrified him was that every morning he'd stand at the entrance of the building and watch all these bright young people come through the door. And their job was to manage other people's money. And he said, you know, they all thought it was a great, fun computer game. But it's not a computer game to the people whose money it was. And he said it's just very hard when people are trading all the time to create this feeling that your job is to be the steward of their money, not to play a computer game.
Thank you. I'm sure there are other questions from the audience, so we shall be pleased to take them. Yes.
Hi, good evening. I haven't read your book yet. I'm gonna do it soon. And but I was interested. My attention was in the title, because you use the word alchemy that led me to think about an older book, The Alchemy of Finance. And the first part of the book, I believe there were quite important ideas, because you mentioned the word ideas at the beginning of this conference. And it was about the idea of reflexivity and the contrast between basically market fundamentalism and so seen as physics, no?
Yes.
And I was just wondering if it's just a coincidence that there is the same word in the two books, or maybe in your book and in your ideas there are some connections or some ideas that might be related to that important book and interesting book. And the second question, sorry, quickly, if you can give us your opinion, your idea about the future after Brexit.
Just a small question thrown in at the end. So, I mean, I wanted to have the word alchemy in the title of my book, because the whole point of it is just to point out to people that the whole banking system is based on the idea that you can somehow convert very short-term deposits, which people assume are safe, into long-term risky loans. And just the same way as you can't just create gold by starting with metals that aren't the same as gold. So there's a real connection with the idea of alchemy, turning something base metal into gold. And that's the problem with the banking system. It's why we've had bank runs and bank crises ever since the banking system began. But the point of the book is to say, as Luca pointed out earlier on, that the attempt to do this actually has some social value, because it's helpful to be able to finance some long-term projects by short-term borrowing, provided the people who are lending to the bank don't all want their money back at the same time. So the question is, I think, not abolishing banking as we have seen it, because then we don't really know how we're going to finance investments, whether it be by companies or house purchased by families. We want to try and keep banking, but try to prevent it being exposed to bank runs, and that's what the pawnbroker proposal is all about. I think, personally, I don't like the phrase reflexivity, because the ideas behind radical uncertainty and the reason why a market economy is not self-stabilizing can be explained in simple, ordinary language. The concepts may take some time to absorb, but you don't need special words to describe it. Economics basically assumes that markets operate by giving signals to people. So, if you're producing something and I want to buy it, but you're worried about how much people are going to buy and what the future demand will be, if there are markets in the thing that you produce, then the people who will buy it will be sending a signal through the price in that market to you, which you can use to decide how much to produce today and how much to invest for the future. But if those markets and the things that you want to produce for the future don't exist, and almost all these markets don't exist, then there's no signal. And if you've got a really good idea tonight when you go home, and you think, gosh, this is the new iPod, a different thing from iPod, but it's the next big thing, and you've got the idea, and you're convinced this is going to be so successful, You'd like to be able to borrow money to invest in a factory to produce it, but you have no idea how many people will buy it. It's a big gamble, radical uncertainty. And you can't pretend that there's a scientific basis for evaluating the investment decision. So I don't think you need fancy words. I just think basic thinking about the problem reveals that a market economy may not be self-stabilizing. Well, I won't say much about Brexit, but and this is a sort of big demand to hear all about Brexit. But I'll just say one thing, which is I think it's very important for people in Italy to understand why we in Britain think that there are three quite different entities. One is Europe, the second is the European Union, and the third is the European Monetary Union. British people love Europe. Our culture has been transformed since the Second World War by mass travel. Our cuisine, just go to British restaurants and compare them with British restaurants 50 years ago, there's no comparison. That's the influence of the continent. We drink wine, we eat good food. British people love travelling in Europe. There has never been a time in our history when more British people went to the rest of Europe, particularly Italy, when they studied in the rest of Europe, when they lived in the rest of Europe, when they intermarried with the rest of Europe. None of this is going to change. People will still want to come to Italy on holiday, and they will carry on doing it. Go to the other extreme, look at the European Monetary Union. We don't think this has been a success. In many ways, it was a project that was started for political reasons. It was a gamble. People assumed that there probably would be a crisis at some point, and that would force people towards a political union. Actually, it's not forcing people towards a political union. The European Central Bank, the presidents of the European Union say we must have a fiscal union in monetary union, but each nation state in the monetary union is not prepared yet to sacrifice that degree of national sovereignty over its own budget policy to agree to a fiscal union. And anyway, if this was going to be the answer, it should have been done in 1999, a sort of mutual insurance agreement. You can't take out an insurance policy once you've had the accident. And the proposal today for a fiscal union is shorthand. Sounds a nice idea. Actually, what it means in practice is Germany paying for everyone else. Germany's not too keen on that. In any event, that's your problem, not ours. We're not in the monetary union, and we don't intend to join it. The bit we're ambivalent about is the bit in the middle, the European Union. When we joined it, it looked completely different. There was no monetary union. We saw the European Union as very much an economic concept, but also one in which gradually integration would proceed. We would recognize each other's professional qualifications so that doctors could come from Italy to practice in Britain, and economics professors in Britain could go and teach in France and Italy. And who knows where that would have led after 50 or 100 years. Well, we're not going to find out, because the adoption of monetary union forced the pace. And this belief in the importance of political union, ever closer union, is a concept that Britain has never shared. We didn't have it when we joined, and we don't have it today. So it's a little bit like saying, 40 odd years ago when we joined the European Union, it was like a tennis club. But you've changed the rules of the game. You've turned it into a golf club. Well, we don't want to play golf, so we're going to resign according to the terms of the membership constitution. And I think this is, in some ways, you should think of this as a rather natural evolution, because the two big problems facing the European Union are first, how to make the monetary union a success, and secondly, how to try to reconcile the Schengen area and the free movement of people with the fact that, which no one imagined, another example of radical uncertainty, that millions of people from Africa, Middle East and Asia want to come and live in the European Union. And this is a massively difficult problem. But every major country in the EU, except the United Kingdom, is in both the monetary union and the Schengen area. We are in neither. So, in a sense, the attempt to pretend that there was just one category of member of the European Union was always going to be something that will create difficulty, and it will create difficulty with countries like Sweden as well. So, who knows what will happen? But we made our decision. I don't think this needs to be a major change. I think that even if the British government ends up, as I think it should prepare for, leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, trading with the rest of the European Union on what are called World Trade Organization rules, which is the basis on which the US and China trade with the European Union. Trade will still carry on. The tariffs are pretty small. There's no reason why, businesses want to trade with other businesses in Europe. As I said, people in Britain want to spend time in the rest of Europe. They'll just go on doing it. They won't be put off by this. And those are the contacts and connections that make sense. So politically, everyone's got terribly excited. I don't actually think there is a reason why people should be so excited. I don't think Brexit is the big challenge facing the European Union. That's the monetary union and immigration. It's a political challenge for the United Kingdom, but that's not your problem. But we can find a way in which we will be able to carry on trading. And I see no reason why in the long run this is going to make a tremendous difference. And I think it's a shame that the political debate, certainly in Britain, became so poisonous between the two sides. I don't think there was a need for it to become so poisonous.
Thank you for giving us such a frank view also on this very topical issue. Are there other questions? Plenty of other questions. Please, here in the middle.
The financial crisis was a crisis also of economics as a discipline.
Yes.
I mean, you can argue that finance was chasing the dream of a out-of-the-break economy of complete market and got lost in the process.
Yes.
Now, afterwards, there's been a lot of revival of Austrian economics, revival of Keynes, even revival of Marx. I mean, where do you think are the most promising strands of research, new direction for economics as a discipline?
Well, I certainly completely agree with the premise of your question, which is that we do need a sort of almost a revolution in economics. I'm not sure if the profession as a whole has really embraced that. I think a lot of the profession is still not willing to move away from the very mathematical set of models which have been at the heart of the professional analysis of economics. And I don't think it makes sense to look backwards and say, well, what did Marx say, what did Keynes say, what did Hayek say? We need to look forwards. So the example that I quite like is if you look at physics in the late 19th century, everyone said, rather like Robert Lucas said, we solved the problems of physics, there's nothing more to be done, it's just technical application. And then Einstein came along and said, actually, you're completely wrong. The physics that you've been doing is just a special case of a more general theory. And I think that's what we ought to be doing. So I would say that the most promising direction of research would be to tackle head on the question of radical uncertainty and ask ourselves, if people cannot know everything that can happen in the future, can't attach probabilities to it, in other words, we don't have a complete set of arrow to grow market, how will they behave? How should we think of their behavior? And one of the dangerous things that happened in economics, I think, was Milton Friedman's view that you didn't worry about the assumptions of a model, provided it helped you understand, the predictions. But actually, I think this is a very dangerous view. If you say, assume people understand how to solve these complex optimization problems, and then just compare the outcomes with the data, you get sucked into a world in which you believe that everything is very mechanical. And I think we ought to step back and say, so people cannot optimize. They know that. They know they're facing radical uncertainty. They've got to find a way of coping with it. What sort of decision rules will people adopt? How will they follow that? How can we advise people on how to take decisions in a world of such uncertainty? That, I think, is the right way to think about it. And I think that we ought to distinguish between the sorts of problems in which conventional economics is very useful. I think microeconomics, where there's no long time dimension, then radical uncertainty is less important. Once you start to make decisions that only have their impact 5-10 years down the road, then radical uncertainty is really important. So my view is that much of the microeconomics that people do, study of industrial organization, auction theory, for example, is probably perfectly satisfactory. But to understand macroeconomic movements in the economy, or booms and slumps, the conventional economic answers are not very helpful at all. And I think reading what Keynes wrote will be very helpful, just as the Austrian contributions are helpful to read. But I don't think we should think that there are doctrines that we need to resurrect. I think we need to look forward and say, so how should we think about this? What's going on in this problem that we need to understand better? I hope some of the people here will do research will actually solve these problems and really set the challenge. I don't have the answers.
There are some students in the room. One of them is just taking the microphone, please.
Yes, hello, sir. So I have a lot of remarks about what you said. I'm very happy, in fact, to hear a central banker talking as you talk, because it seems like less and less the people responsible for governing our economy, and so the state of the economy when I will be older, are still very into those kinds of models, which are really not at all corresponding to the reality. So I'm really happy about that. But I was expecting maybe a bit more about the way incentives are structured for the people who work in finance. Because now they make a huge amount of money, and I see people of my age really interested into going into finance because of the money, not as before. So that means that there has been a change. I hear sometimes that people who used to work in Lehman during the 1940s had to have another job next to their job as a banker. So I was wondering, do you really think that we should not prosecute those people which were involved into predatory lending, so to people who were just putting their life into the banker's hands? Yes.
Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, clearly, if people broke the criminal law, they should be prosecuted and take the penalty. And many of the people who manipulated the libel quotes in order to profit their own trade, some of them have been prosecuted, some of them have been convicted, others have been acquitted. They have been subject to the rule of law, and I don't think we should interfere in that. But somehow I feel that the idea that we had a financial crisis because of people being paid too much or behaving in a cynical or selfish way is wrong. I think one of the most fundamental problems that we saw in the crisis was that over the previous 25 years, long-term interest rates, real interest rates after adjusting for expected inflation, which for most of recorded history were between 3% a year and 5% a year, started to fall. And they kept falling, and they're close to zero, even today. I don't think a market economy could function properly when there's no incentive for people to save, when it's too expensive to save to provide a pension later in life. And the people who are suffering from low interest rates, interestingly, are not often the older people who complain most about not earning anything on their portfolio, but the young people. Because when interest rates fell over 25 years, asset prices kept rising. And that had two consequences. One is that for people who are much younger than me, it's now very expensive to save for a pension, which is why people feel, why should I bother? And it's also very expensive to buy a house, because they're incredibly expensive now, relative to income. That is the consequence of the fall in interest rates, not, I think, the predatory behaviour of banking. And the amount of lending that was done on subprime mortgage lending was actually pretty small. It didn't cause the crisis. I don't defend the behaviour. And if people did missell products, break regulations or break the law, they should be prosecuted, indeed, somehow. And it may be that we should spend more time thinking about the incentives facing these people. But deep down, my instinct is to say, what we need to do is to say, these are the regulations for the banking entity. The chairman and the chief executive and the board of directors have the responsibility for thinking about the incentives that they give their employees to behave in the right sort of way. And I think once you start to intervene in that from outside, then actually you take responsibility away from the chief executive and the board. And then the regulators take responsibility for it, which is the worst of all outcomes, because then you can never hold the board or the chief executive to account. So, I sympathise with your wish to punish bad behaviour, but I don't think that bad behaviour was the secret to understanding why we had a big financial crisis. That was a series of big macroeconomic, quote, mistakes, unquote, where people didn't understand what could happen, what the consequences of their actions were. And it's always easy to have wisdom with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, the biggest source of wisdom is always with hindsight. The difficult bit is to find wisdom beforehand. And if people didn't exhibit that, I don't think we should sort of hit them over the head and blame them. We should understand that no one can really be expected to have wisdom beforehand in a world of radical uncertainty. But what we can do is design a regulatory system and a structure for our economy that is as robust to radical uncertainty as we can make it.
Perhaps, if I may, I would add to that the reform that you propose would have an effect on the type of incentives that people follow in the banking industry. Because one of the reasons why the outrageous salaries that we have seen recently are paid in the banking industry is because it has grown tremendously with respect to the function it ought to perform in the economic system. So if we manage to create a monetary system which keeps banks in a more moderate dimension and avoids the growth of banks and the concentration of banks that we have witnessed over the past years, perhaps it also has implications on how banks are run.
Yeah, I think that's true. And of course, one of the problems that arose when interest rates kept falling and asset prices were going up is that people who were managing funds, managing investments, kept seeing that the value of these investments was rising. And they thought, oh gosh, I must be a brilliant fund manager. But anyone can make money in that situation just by buying and hold. It was the fall in interest rates that was producing the profits. But of course, people in the industry have an incentive to claim, oh, we've earned all these profits, we should get, our 20% of it or whatever. And so they were being paid a lot. And I do think that one of the reforms that's needed, though I think it needs to come from the industry as a whole, is to say the way that people are compensated for managing money is too generous on their part. What you need to do is to give incentives to managers for doing something that's special about their fund versus other funds. It's the same with anybody in the car industry. If suddenly a lot more people want to buy cars and you're working in a car company, there's no reason why you should get a big bonus because more people are buying cars. What you really want to do is to say, are you improving the performance of our company relative to other companies? That's the basis for giving people a bonus. That didn't happen in the financial sector. And there were some even more extreme outcomes where using complicated accounting in derivative instruments, people made transactions in which they managed to convert what would be a stream of earnings in the future over often 20 or 30 years into a present discounted value today, and then pay themselves a bonus out of the present discounted value today, rather than waiting for the profits to actually emerge over that longer period. That was, I think, a very unfortunate outcome. So I think there are things that could be done to improve the incentives. You're absolutely right on that. And maybe regulators have a role to draw this to people's attention. But deep down, the shareholders of banks, the shareholders of other companies, ought to be asking themselves questions about what are the incentives that our company is giving their employees, and are they taking money away from the shareholders and the customers? And I think more shareholders are doing that now. You can start to see some activist investors complaining about the salary and compensation packages which the executives are paying themselves. And it is an issue, I accept. But I don't think this issue was responsible for the financial crisis.
Thank you. I see that it is 7:45. Perhaps we have time for another couple of questions.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Well, I wanted to ask, you created this term of the nice decade, and I would like to couple this with the fact that actually we didn't witness a crisis this big for the first time, because we already had experienced the Great Depression in the 20s. So I wanted to know if there is a link between the two, and how much of this link is actually rooted in this decade, because, for example, the behavior of bankers like Bernanke and also in Europe has reacted to the lessons that we've learned from the past. So actually, maybe there was something that we could do before the crisis, and that maybe we didn't do because of our thoughts about the fact that actually some problems were solved once and for all.
So it's an interesting question. I'd say this, that when I talked about the NICE decade, which was meant to be an acronym for non-inflationary, consistently expansionary decade, the whole point of that speech, which was the first speech I gave as Governor of the Bank of England, was to say the past decade has been nice, but the future won't be. And the point of it was to say that everything has looked very stable in the past, but it's not sustainable. And we shouldn't confuse stability with sustainability. And this could not go on. And something had to give, and of course it gave with the financial crisis. Now, why didn't people do something about it beforehand? It's a good question. And my answer is that actually it was very difficult for any one country on its own to do anything that would prevent the crisis as a whole without damaging itself. So we actually discussed this on the Monetary Policy Committee in Britain. And we said, look, domestic demand is unsustainably high. This can't go on forever. Something will give. There'll be a big jolt downwards or something. What can we do? Well, we said we could raise interest rates to slow down domestic spending and hope that the foreign exchange market would come to its senses and push down the value of sterling, which would encourage more exports, which would take the place of the domestic demand that we'd squeezed out through raising interest rates. And then we would get still steady growth with low inflation, but in a much more balanced way. The argument against that, which eventually won the day on the committee, was that, but if we put up interest rates, Normally, when you do that, markets push up the exchange rate, not push it down. And we may not have any guarantee that people will actually push the exchange rate down. The immediate result could well be the exchange rate goes up. That means that exports will go down rather than go up. And so we'll have a contraction of domestic spending and a contraction of exports. We'll have a recession. And this was true in every country. No one country on its own could easily get out of this. And I use the phrase prisoner's dilemma in the book to explain that most of the problems we saw before the crisis had this characteristic, which was that the players were all facing a prisoner's dilemma. It's true of central banks. They couldn't stop this happening. It was true of governments, and it was also true of banks. The very famous comment of Mr. Prince, who was the chief executive of Citibank, who said just before the crisis hit that, you know, people asked him, why are you buying and selling these complex securities? And he said, well, while the music's playing, we've got to go on dancing. We'll go on dancing. Now, if he'd said 5 years earlier, you know, we're a bit worried about these derivative instruments. They're too complex. We don't really understand them. We're going to stop trading them. If he'd done that 5 years earlier, then for the next 3 or 4 years, Citibank would have made lower profits than their competitors, and he almost certainly would have lost his job. It was only the crisis as a whole that made people realize that what they were doing in trading these complex securities was taking a lot of risk. So he himself had no incentive to stand out from the crowd. It's the same problem in the stock market. When people think, you know, the stock market's gone too high, there's a bubble. And the first person who says, we're not going to invest in this anymore, we're going to stay out of the stock market. If the bubble still carries on for an extra year or two, they lose a lot of money. And they'll lose their customers, their clients. So a lot of people feel it stays to be with the crowd. Don't do anything different, whether it's banking or investment or indeed in central banking. And I think that will be my explanation of why people could see that things were not sustainable, but they had no incentive to do anything about it. Go back to the incentives point.
Perhaps one last question?
Thank you. I have a question about monetary policy. The question is, maybe we are going to see a major change next year in the US. Federal Reserve is going maybe to change its chair and also vice chair actually. And do you see the possibility that we see monetary policy going back to the old way of doing things, maybe during the 80s and 90s? So what maybe John Taylor is calling for, so going back to sound rules about monetary policy. And also maybe if I can ask about what's your thinking about management of central bank larger balance sheets. But before you mentioned that maybe you see this actual dimension as more appropriate to manage liquidity, to provide liquidity to banks, but also there are some drawbacks from the fiscal side, because if assets go down because interest rates rise, maybe some central bank at some point, since they pay interest on excess reserves, maybe they can be caught in a situation where they might be forced to ask parliaments to put money to recapitalize the banks. So it's a quite complex situation. I would like to know your opinion. Thank you.
So let me take that second one first. I think, so my advice to central banks would be that rather than reduce the size of their balance sheet too quickly, I would want to keep the size of the commercial banks' deposits with the central bank still pretty high, because that guarantees a certain amount of liquidity in the system. what I would recommend that central banks stop doing is to buying assets other than government bonds. And I think the risk that central banks take is when they start to take private sector credit risk, whether they buy corporate bonds, whether they buy any other instrument. Buying their own government's paper, I think, was a sensible thing to do. And you can debate about whether they should do more or less. But if they want to tighten monetary policy, which is obviously the direction in which policy is likely to be going, then raising interest rates, I'm sure, is the right thing to do. And that is what they will prefer to do. Because certainly the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England would love to find themselves back at an interest rate of at least 2-3%. Because then, if there were another downturn unexpectedly, they could cut rates. Where they are now, they can't cut rates. So what will happen to the Fed next year? Big change of personnel. Certainly, President Trump could end up making 5 appointments to the Federal Reserve Board, basically determining the whole complexion. A new chair, new vice chair, a special vice chair for regulation. So all of these posts will become vacant. So it could look very different. John Taylor is one of the names that have been mentioned, but there are others. I don't think it will be a question of going back to the 80s. After all, the Federal Reserve never did use the Taylor rule. But I think we just do not know what kinds of people President Trump will appoint, or how they would behave once they had been appointed. Sometimes people get appointed to a central bank, and once they're there, they behave differently from the way the president who appointed them had hoped they would behave. And, possibly President Trump will appoint people who've got experience of central banking or monetary economists, people like John Taylor or Kevin Walsh or Martin Feldstein. Or maybe he will appoint business figures, people who have been chief executives of large companies, who will have a different perspective. We don't know. So I think President Trump is a good note to end on, because right through the book, I place a lot of emphasis on radical uncertainty. There is no person in the world who demonstrates that more than President Trump.
Thank you very much to our guest, the author of the book, Lord King. Thanks to all of you for having been here and stayed with us for so long. I think that the conversation was a source of inspiration and gave us a lot of wisdom from his experience as a central banker. I remind you that you can find the book downstairs, and if you are interested, you can purchase it as you walk out. Thanks again to the organizers, and good evening to all of you.
And I'll be signing the books if you want.
Exactly, sorry, I did not mention that.